The year 1881 blew into Dust Creek on a wind that tasted of rust. It was a dry, restless wind that scraped the red dirt from the ground and threw it against everything, tinting the world in a perpetual haze of faded blood. It slammed shutters against weathered clapboard with a rhythm like a tired drum corps, and found its way through the cracks in window frames and under doors, leaving a fine grit on every table, every blanket, every plate. The sun wasn't a gentle warmth. It was a weight, a heavy, shattered light that bleached the sky to a pale, unforgiving blue and baked the very life out of the splintered boardwalks. Into this parched landscape rode Eli Barrett. He sat his buckskin mare not with the easy slouch of a cowhand, but with a rigid stillness. A man braced against more than just the wind. His ranch, Lone Spur, lay a few miles out, an isolated patch of deeded land that drank from a spring the townsfolk swore was cursed. Eli himself seemed carved from the same hard country. His hands, resting on the worn pommel of his saddle, were thick with calluses, the knuckles scarred and the fingers permanently shaped to the curve of a rope or a tool handle. His shoulders were broad and solid under a faded chambray shirt, muscles layered from a life of heaving, lifting, and holding on. But it was his eyes that held the true story of his solitude. They were the color of a stormy sky, deep set under a low brow, and they rarely settled on anything for long. They scanned, they measured, but they didn't invite. They were the eyes of a man who had stopped expecting words to fix anything. He was riding back from the mercantile, 2 burlap sacks of flour and salt tied behind his saddle, when he saw the trouble at Cottonwood Creek. The creek itself was a misnomer this time of year, more a collection of muddy puddles connected by a trickle of water than a proper stream. A sturdy wagon, its canvas cover proclaiming a hopeful future, was mired to its axle on the far bank. The horse, a fine-looking chestnut, stood with its head low, its sides heaving, exhausted from the struggle. A woman stood beside the stuck wheel, her hands on her hips, staring at the muddy obstacle as if she could dismantle it with the force of her will. She was dressed in a dark blue traveling dress, practical and well-made, but now spattered with mud and coated in a fine layer of the ubiquitous red dust. Her bonnet had fallen back to hang by its ribbons around her neck, revealing hair the color of corn silk, pinned up in a sensible knot that was beginning to fray around the edges. Eli reined in his mare. Sage, he had no want for company, no taste for town business, and trouble was the one crop Dust Creek grew in abundance. He could ride on. It wasn't his concern. But his father had taught him that you don't leave a horse to suffer, and that principle extended, by necessity, to its driver. With a sigh that was more a quiet shifting of air than a sound, he nudged Sage forward, fording the shallow water until he stood on the bank beside her. He didn't speak. He simply dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, and walked to the back of the wagon. He sized it up, his gaze taking in the angle of the wheel, the depth of the mud, the strain on the axle. The woman turned, startled. She hadn't heard his approach over the ceaseless wind. Her eyes were a clear, startling green, and they widened for a moment before her expression settled back into one of determined competence. "Good day," she said, her voice clear and steady, with an Eastern cadence that was as out of place here as a porcelain teacup. "As you can see, I found myself in a bit of a predicament." Eli just grunted, a sound of acknowledgement. He ran a hand over the rough wood of the wagon frame. "You push on the spokes, keep it from sliding back," he said. His voice was raspy, unused. "I've been pushing," she replied, a faint note of exasperation in her tone. "It doesn't seem to be enough." He didn't answer. He moved to the rear of the wagon, planting his feet wide. He bent low, his hands finding a purchase on the underside of the thick axle. He took a breath, and then he lifted. The muscles in his back and shoulders bunched into hard ridges beneath his shirt. A deep groan of stressed wood echoed the grunt that was torn from his own chest. The wagon shuddered, lifting a fraction of an inch from the sucking mud. Dust and sweat mingled on his temples, and the sinews in his neck stood out like cords. He was a man applying his entire being to a single, stubborn point of resistance. Now! He forced the word out through clenched teeth. The woman, June Mallory, needed no further instruction. She threw her shoulder against the wheel, her hands gripping the dusty spokes, and pushed with all her might. The hem of her dress sank into the mud, and the fine fabric of her sleeve strained at the seam. But she didn't falter. She felt the slight shift, the barest hint of movement as Eli's brute strength took the weight. The wheel groaned, scraped against a rock, and then, with a final, shuddering lurch, it rolled free onto solid ground. Eli let the wagon down with a heavy thud. Stepping back and wiping a forearm across his brow, he stood there, breathing heavily, not looking at her. He flexed his hands, staring at them as if they belonged to someone else. "Thank you," June said, her own breath coming in shallow gasps. She tried to brush the dust from her dress, a futile gesture. "Truly, I don't know what I would have done. My name is June Mallory." He gave a short, sharp nod. Eli Barrett. The name hung in the air between them, heavier than the afternoon heat. Barrett. Even a newcomer would hear that name within a day of arriving in Dust Creek. It was spoken in whispers in the general store, in knowing murmurs over poker games at the Red Dog Saloon. The Barretts were bad luck. The story went, Old Man Barrett had lost his wife to fever, then lost his savings to a bad cattle market before the land finally took him. And Eli. The son who stayed, he had the worst of it. The fire, 3 years back. The loss. People said the Lone Spur Ranch didn't just have bad luck, it was a magnet for it. Anyone who got too close, they said, ended up leaving town one way or another broke, or hurt, or gone for good, as if summoned by the name. Eyes appeared. From the shadowed doorway of the saloon, a few men had stopped their game to watch. The lanky form of the blacksmith paused by his forge, hammer in hand. A curtain twitched in the window of the boarding house. They weren't just watching a wagon get pulled from the mud. They were watching the new schoolteacher, the fresh hope from the east, have her first encounter with the town's resident misfortune. Eli saw the watchers. He felt their gaze like a physical touch, a familiar, unwelcome pressure. His shoulders, which had been momentarily relaxed, tightened again. He turned to go, to mount his horse and ride away from the name and the stares that came with it. "Mr. Barrett," June's voice stopped him. He paused, his back still to her. "They're watching us," she said, her tone quiet, matter-of-fact. She wasn't looking at the town. She was looking at him, at the rigid line of his spine. He finally turned his head, his stormy eyes meeting hers. A muscle worked in his jaw. It was a warning, a dismissal. He was giving her a chance to step away, to put distance between herself and his cursed name. June held his gaze. She saw the hardness there, but underneath it, she saw a weariness so profound it looked like a permanent part of him. She saw the man who had stopped his day to help a stranger, who had strained every muscle in his body for her without asking a single question. She lifted her chin, the dust on her cheek highlighting the fine line of her jaw. "I don't care who's watching," she said, and the words were not a challenge, but a simple statement of fact. Something flickered in Eli's eyes, surprise, maybe, or something else he couldn't name. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind and the distant clink of a glass from the saloon. He gave another one of his curt nods, a gesture that seemed to contain a whole unspoken conversation. Then he turned, swung himself up onto Sage's back with an economy of motion, and touched the brim of his hat. It wasn't a tip, just a bare acknowledgement. Then he was gone, riding out of town without a backward glance, leaving June Mallory standing alone by her freed wagon, the dust settling around her feet. Inside the Red Dog Saloon, the whispers picked up where the wind left off. "Foolish girl," muttered a card player named Silas, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Don't she know who that is? He's got the devil's own luck, that one," another added, shuffling a worn deck of cards. "She best keep her distance if she plans on staying." Hattie, the woman who ran the saloon and knew every piece of gossip before it was even spoken, polished a glass behind the bar. Her eyes narrowed. "Maybe she's different. Or maybe she's just the next one to learn the hard way. The men grunted in agreement. The verdict passed. The new school teacher was either a fool or a future tragedy. A sudden, fierce gust of wind rattled the saloon doors, carrying with it the smell of hot dust, the faint, greasy scent of saddle leather from Eli's mare, and something else, something older. It was the smell of sun-scorched wood, a phantom scent of char that seemed to cling to the air around the memory of Eli Barrett's name. June watched him until he was just a small silhouette against the vast, empty horizon. The heat was oppressive, and the encounter had left her trembling slightly, though whether from exertion or the intensity of the man's presence, she couldn't say. She knew what she had walked into. She had heard the whispers about the Barretts even in the last town she'd passed through, a lonely rancher, a family shadowed by disaster. She had been warned, but she had also seen a man's strength offered freely, had felt the quiet dignity in his refusal to engage with the town's silent judgment. The sky was darkening, not with evening, but with the bruised purple of an oncoming summer storm. She needed shelter, and the small room she'd rented at the boarding house seemed a world away, as if he'd read her thoughts from a mile off. She saw a rider approaching. It was Eli again. He didn't ride all the way back to her. He stopped 20 yards away and pointed with a gloved hand towards a dilapidated structure just off the main road, a small, abandoned shed that had likely once been a smithy's workshop or a storage barn. "You can put your wagon in there," he called out, his voice snatched and tossed by the wind. "Roof's mostly solid. It'll keep you dry." Before she could form a reply, he wheeled his horse around and was gone for good this time, melting into the dusty twilight. The offer was as blunt and unadorned as the man himself. Not an invitation, but a solution, a practical kindness, offered at a distance. She led her tired horse to the shed, the wheels of her wagon bumping over the uneven ground. The doors creaked open on rusty hinges to reveal a space filled with the scent of old hay and dust motes dancing in the fading light. It was shelter. It was enough. As she unhitched her horse, her mind replayed the moment by the creek. The strain in his face as he lifted the wagon, the startling quiet of his eyes, and the clear, simple truth of her own words. "I don't care who's watching." She had said it for him, a defense against the prying eyes of the town. But as the first drops of rain began to speckle the dust outside, she realized she had also said it for herself. It was a promise. She had come to Dust Creek to teach, to build something. She would not let it be torn down by whispers and shadows before she had even begun. Miles away, Eli Barrett rode toward the solitary light of his ranch house. The exertion of lifting the wagon had settled into a deep ache in his muscles, a familiar burn that he usually welcomed. But tonight, it had woken something else, a phantom pain, sharp and hot, flared across his left shoulder blade, tracing the path of a puckered, silvered scar hidden beneath his shirt. He closed his eyes for a second against the sensation, but the image was already there, burned into his memory. The smell of smoke and panicked livestock, the roar of flames eating dry timber, the terrible, suffocating heat, and the loss, a gaping hole that no amount of work or solitude could ever fill. The scar on his skin was a map of that night, and tonight, for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was burning all over again. The abandoned stable smelled of history, not the grand history of battles and treaties, but the small, honest history of sweat and hay and horses. June Mallory worked to overlay a new scent of soap, a fresh-cut pine for benches, of chalk dust. She had swept the packed earth floor a dozen times, yet a fine red film always returned, a ghost of the Dust Creek wind. The structure was a loan from the blacksmith, a man whose gruffness was tempered by the memory of his own mother, who had never learned to read. June's school was an act of defiant creation. She'd whitewashed the interior walls herself, her arms aching for days afterward. A large slab of slate, chipped at one corner, was propped against the far wall. Tilting ever so slightly, it was her blackboard. Her chalk was a collection of nubs, carefully guarded in a small tin box. Her students, A half-dozen children between the ages of 6 and 10 came with patched clothes and bare feet, their souls tough as leather. But their eyes were bright, hungry for the shapes of letters and the sound of stories that traveled further than the town's single dusty road. They watched her with a fierce, unwavering attention. Their small bodies perched on the rough pine benches Eli Barrett had delivered one evening, leaving them stacked silently by the door without a word and disappearing before she could offer thanks. They called her Miss June, the two words a small, perfect song in the quiet of the stable. She taught them sums with pebbles and letters with a stick in the dirt floor when chalk was low. She taught them that the world was wider than Dust Creek, that history was more than the town's collection of grudges. She was patient and firm, her voice a calm anchor in the gusty afternoons. In this cramped, reclaimed space, surrounded by the smell of hay and the earnest breathing of children, June felt a sense of purpose so clean and solid it was like a stone in her hand, miles away, under the yellow light of a kerosene lamp. Eli Barrett engaged in a different kind of arithmetic. The pages of his ledger were filled with his neat, blocky script. He wasn't counting assets. He was counting debts. A column for hay, another for oats, a long list of supplies from the mercantile. Each entry a small weight added to the load he already carried. The numbers told a story of drought, of a bad year for feed, of a ranch hanging on by a thread. He ran a calloused finger down the final column. The deadline loomed, printed not in his own hand but in the precise, elegant script of a bank clerk. The note on his land, the loan his father had taken out in a hopeful year, was coming due. He'd ridden into town that morning, not for supplies, but to the Dust Creek Bank. It was the only stone building on the main street, a squat, solid declaration of permanence in a town that felt anything but inside. It was cool and quiet, the air smelling of paper and polished wood. Jasper Stone, the bank's owner, sat behind a large oak desk, a man as neat and contained as his surroundings. He was not old, but his face was thin and unlined, as if he'd never allowed an emotion to linger long enough to leave a mark. Only his smile was old. It was a thin, bloodless curve of the lips that never reached his pale gray eyes. "Mr. Barrett," Stone had said, his voice smooth as a worn coin. He gestured to the chair opposite him, an invitation that felt like a summons. "Come to discuss your account. I presume—" Eli remained standing. "I'll have the payment." Stone steepled his fingers, the manicured nails a stark contrast to Eli's own scarred hands. "I have no doubt you will endeavor to, but the terms are quite clear. The land is the collateral. The deadline is firm." He let the words settle in the quiet room. Then he added, his smile tightening almost imperceptibly, "Dust Creek needs stability. Eli, land is stability. Sometimes it must change hands for the greater good, to be managed by those with a less complicated history." He looked directly at Eli. "When the note comes due, the land will find its proper owner." It was not a threat. It was a prophecy, delivered with the calm certainty of a man who owned the future. The words echoed in Eli's mind now as he stared at the ledger. A less complicated history. That was Stone's polite term for the Barrett curse. The rumor was a living thing in Dust Creek, an invisible pestilence. It spread in the evening, like the smell of stale whiskey from the saloon doors. It was a story told and retold, gaining new details with each telling a fence that collapsed for no reason, a well that ran dry, a calf born sickly. Every misfortune, small or large, was attributed to the dark cloud that hung over Lone Spur. Eli knew Stone didn't believe in curses, but he believed in their power. A curse could lower the value of a man's word, isolate him, and make his land easier to pick off, like a lone steer separated from the herd. A few days later, June found the knife. She was walking by Cottonwood Creek, gathering smooth, flat stones for the children to practice their letters on. Something glinted in the mud near where her wagon had been stuck. She worked it free and washed it in the slow-moving water. It was a clasp knife, its wooden handle dark and worn smooth with use. It was a tool, not a weapon, its blade sharpened for cutting rope or whittling a stick. On one side of the handle, 2 letters had been carved into the wood with painstaking care. E.B. She knew she had to return it. The thought of seeking him out sent a strange flutter through her chest, a mix of apprehension and something else she didn't want to name. She found him by the public water trough late the next afternoon, filling 2 large barrels on the back of a buckboard. He worked with a silent, rhythmic efficiency, his shoulders moving with practiced strength as he hauled the heavy buckets. June waited until he was finished. She approached slowly, holding the knife in her palm. "Mr. Barrett," she said. He turned, his body tensing slightly at the sound of his name. His eyes, guarded as ever, fell to the object in her hand. He didn't speak. "I believe this is yours," she said, holding it out. "I found it by the creek." He looked from the knife to her face, then back to the knife. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, he wiped his wet hands on his canvas trousers and reached out, his fingers brushing hers as he took it. The touch was brief, accidental, but it felt like a spark in the dry air. His hands were rough, hers were soft, and for a fraction of a second, the space between them vanished. He turned the knife over in his palm, his thumb tracing the familiar shape of the carved letters. It was a gesture so personal, so unconsciously intimate, that June felt like an intruder. They stood there in an awkward, profound silence, suspended between the need to speak and the habit of quiet. The only sounds were the soft clucking of a few hens scratching in the dust nearby and the distant, rhythmic squeak of a passing wagon's wheel. It was a whole world of sound in the absence of their own voices. Finally, he looked up, not quite meeting her eyes, but looking at a point just past her shoulder. "Thank you," he said. The 2 words were low and gravelly, costing him an obvious effort. He pocketed the knife, gave one of his short, decisive nods, and turned back to his buckboard. The conversation, such as it was over. June stood for a moment, watching him secure the barrels with a length of rope, his movements sure and economical. She had returned a lost item, a simple transaction. Yet it felt like more. It felt like she had handed him back a piece of himself, a piece he hadn't even realized was missing. That evening, the talk in the Red Dog Saloon turned once again to the new teacher. "Saw her talking to Barrett by the trough," Silas announced to the room at large, slamming a domino down on the table. "Handed him something. Mark my words," Hattie said, wiping the bar with a damp rag. "She's got a soft heart. This town will either harden it or break it. Barrett will be the one to break it." Another man grunted. "They all leave. That place, that man, he just withers things. She'll be on the next stagecoach out before the first snow." The men around the table nodded, a consensus of cynical certainty. It was the way of things. Dust Creek didn't hold on to soft hearts for long. Later that night, a deep loneliness settled over the plains. The mournful howl of a lone wolf drifted in on the wind, a sound that made the small pool of light from June's lamp feel fragile and small. She sat at her small writing desk in a room at the boarding house, her diary open before her. The page was filled with notes on her students, on the challenges of teaching with so few resources. But at the bottom of the page, she wrote a new sentence, the ink flowing dark and decisive from her pen. "They whisper about him," she wrote. "They watch him. They judge him from a distance. As a group, I'm afraid of their whispers, of their collective certainty. I'm afraid of the crowd, but I am not afraid of one man." She closed the book, the leather cover cool beneath her fingers. She was not naive. She understood the power of a town's opinion, the weight of a shared story. But she also believed in the evidence of her own eyes, a man's strength, a quiet act of gratitude for a returned knife, a solitude that felt more like a shield than a threat. At that same moment, Eli Barrett was not in his house. He had finished his chores, the silence of his ranch pressing in on him. He found himself walking, his boots stirring silent puffs of dust in the moonlight, his path leading him not towards his own lonely porch, but towards the faint light spilling from the cracks in the old stable at the edge of town. He stopped in the deep shadow of a cottonwood tree, a place where he could see but not be seen. He could hear her voice, a low, steady murmur. He couldn't make out all the words, only the gentle cadence, the patient rhythm of a teacher explaining the world. He moved a little closer, drawn by the sound, and then he heard it, a single word, spoken clearly, repeated for a student to learn. Hope. Her voice drifted out into the night air. Hope. It means a belief that good things will come. It is a light in the darkness. Eli stood frozen in the shadows, the word washing over him. Hope. It was a foreign word in his language of debt and loss and survival. It was a feeling he had packed away and buried long ago, like a treasured object he could no longer bear to look at. Yet here it was, being spoken into the night, being taught in a dusty stable. He listened as she had the children repeat it, their small voices piping up, uncertain at first, then stronger. Hope. He did not know how long he stood there, a silent, unseen student in the darkness, listening to the sound of a word he had forgotten he ever knew, when he finally turned and walked back toward the profound emptiness of Lone Spur. The wolf had fallen silent, and the single syllable echoed in the quiet of his own heart. The scar on Eli Barrett's left shoulder was a permanent storm cloud on his skin. In the privacy of his small, sparse bedroom, with the day's work done and the evening's quiet pressing in, he would sometimes trace its puckered edges. It was not a clean scar from a knife or a bullet. It was a chaotic landscape of melted, pulled tissue, the work of fire. Touching it was like touching a memory, and the memory always came with the smell of smoke and the high, terrified bellowing of cattle. 3 years ago, the air had been just as dry, the wind just as restless. A spark, the sheriff had said, from a lantern knocked over, maybe, or a stray ember from the forge. No one knew for sure. Eli only knew the roar. He'd woken to a sky turned orange, the big barn, the heart of the ranch, a towering inferno against the night. He and Owen, his younger brother by 2 years, had thrown themselves into the chaos. Not to save the barn, it was already lost, but to save the animals. They'd worked in a choking, blinding hell, cutting ropes, driving panicked steers and cows out into the open pasture as burning timbers crashed down around them. The heat was a living thing, a predator that seared the lungs and blistered the skin. A falling beam had caught Eli, pinning him, the flaming wood biting deep into his shoulder. He remembered Owen's face, pale and determined in the flickering firelight, straining to heave the timber off him. Owen was slighter than Eli, but he had a wiry strength and a spirit that never seemed to find an obstacle too large. He'd gotten the beam off, and Eli, his shoulder a vortex of agony, had stumbled to his feet. They had gotten most of the herd out, but a young calf, born just that spring, had bolted in terror not towards the open field, but towards the narrow, rocky canyon that bordered the east pasture. "I'll get her," Owen had yelled over the roar of the fire. "Don't want her breaking a leg in the rocks." Eli, his vision swimming, had tried to stop him. "Leave it. It's not worth it." But Owen was already gone, disappearing into the smoke. That was the last time Eli saw him alive. While Eli was fighting the fire, a different part of the land had moved. The heat and the vibration, or maybe just the same bad luck that haunted their name, had loosened the rocks on the canyon wall. A section of the cliff face had sheared off, a quiet, deadly slide of stone and earth that had buried the narrow pass, the calf, and his brother in an instant. Eli had survived the fire. Owen, untouched by the flames, had been swallowed by the earth, in the cold. Gray light of dawn, the townsfolk who came to help had looked from the smoldering ruins of the barn to the fresh rock slide, and then to Eli, the lone survivor. They didn't have to say the words. He could see it in their eyes. The Barrett sentence. It wasn't a court of law that passed it down, but the quiet, unshakable consensus of the community. The Barrett land was hungry. It had taken his mother, his father, and now his brother. It had left Eli standing, but marked him. A man sentenced to live out his days on cursed ground, a walking testament to the ranch's dark appetite. The guilt was a heavier weight than any timber. Owen had died saving a calf while Eli, The older, stronger brother had lived. It was a debt he could never repay. In her small schoolhouse, June Mallory's hand faltered as she wrote a word on the slate blackboard. Family. Family. She paused, the nub of chalk suddenly heavy in her fingers. A tremor ran through her hand, a faint, almost imperceptible shaking she had learned to control, but could never fully erase. For her students, the word meant a mother's apron, a father's calloused hand, the warmth of a shared bed on a cold night. For June, it meant the cool, judgmental eyes of Reverend Michael Thorne and the suffocating silence of a town that chose comfort over truth. She had been engaged to him back in Ohio. He was a man of great charisma, his sermons filling the pews every Sunday. His family was the most respected in the county, a pillar of righteousness. But June, living in his home as his betrothed, had seen the cracks in the facade. She saw how he manipulated the church elders, how he used the collection plate to fund his own comfortable lifestyle, how he shamed poor families for their lack of donations while his own pantry overflowed. He spoke of charity but practiced greed. When she confronted him, he had smiled that smooth, polished smile of his and told her that a woman's place was to support her husband's holy work, not to question it. He told her she was hysterical. So she had gathered the proof, the altered ledgers, the letters demanding gifts from vulnerable parishioners, and she had walked away, not just from the engagement, but from the entire life that had been planned for her. She presented the evidence to the bishop, and in doing so, broke the unspoken rule. She had chosen truth over family, over security. The reverend was quietly reassigned, the scandal buried, but June was branded a troublemaker, a difficult woman. The whispers followed her, closing doors, chilling friendships. So she had come west, seeking a place where her name was unknown, where she could build something that was honest all the way through, even if it was in a dusty, forgotten stable. The tremor in her hand was a reminder of the cost of that choice. Dust Creek had its own reverend, its own pillar of the community, Jasper Stone. He didn't preach from a pulpit, but from behind his polished oak desk at the bank. His business, as Eli knew too well, was land. Men who had come west with high hopes often met with drought, disease, or disaster. Stone was always there to offer a loan, his terms seemingly reasonable. But when misfortune struck, he was unbending. He bought their bad debt for pennies on the dollar, foreclosed with quiet efficiency, and added their small plots to his ever-growing map of holdings around Dust Creek. He was patient. He let the land, the weather, and bad luck do the hard work for him. He was not a vulture circling a dying animal. He was the patient drought, slowly sucking the life out of the land until it fell into his hands. One afternoon, as June was dismissing her students, a small boy named Samuel tugged on her sleeve. "Miss June," he said, his face serious, "you tell Mr. Barrett to fix his gate." "What's wrong with his gate?" "Samuel." "It gets stuck," the boy said, joined by a chorus of nods from the other children. "We seen it when we go hunting for lizards up that way. The big one, on the cattle pen. Sometimes it won't open, sometimes it won't close. It's a real stubborn gate." June filed the information away. It was a small thing, a piece of childish observation, but it was odd. Eli Barrett was not a man who let things fall into disrepair. His fences were taut, his tools were clean. A stubborn gate didn't seem like his kind of problem. The next day, the smell hit her. It was sharp and acrid, a chemical bitterness that clung to the back wall of the stable. It smelled like tar, or creosote. She searched the area and found a dark, greasy stain on the exterior wall, low to the ground, as if a bucket had been overturned or splashed there by a careless passerby. It was another small, strange thing. Who would be carrying a bucket of tar behind the schoolhouse? She scrubbed at the stain, but the oily residue remained, and the smell lingered for days, a sour note in the honest scent of hay and chalk. A week later, the first autumn storm threatened, the sky piling up with dark, bruised-looking clouds. A fierce wind ripped at the stable, and a section of the old roof shingles tore loose, clattering to the ground. It was a repair she couldn't make herself. With a heavy heart, knowing she had to ask a favor of a man who dealt in nods and monosyllables, she walked the long, dusty road out to Lone Spur. She found Eli reinforcing a fence line. He worked without looking up as she approached, the rhythmic thud of his mallet the only sound besides the wind. "Mr. Barrett," she began, having to raise her voice. "I'm sorry to bother you. The storm, it took some shingles off the schoolhouse roof. I was hoping—" He didn't let her finish. He just drove the post he was holding deep into the ground with 2 final, powerful blows, laid his tools down, and walked past her toward his own workshop. He returned a moment later with a hammer, a pouch of nails, and a bundle of fresh-cut shingles under his arm. He strode past her again, heading for town, expecting her to follow. He worked on the roof with the same silent, focused intensity he applied to everything. He didn't ask for her help, but she stayed, holding the ladder, handing him shingles and nails when he gestured for them. The air between them was thick with things unsaid. She wanted to thank him, to ask about the stubborn gait, to break through the wall of silence he carried around him like a coat. But his posture, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he meticulously avoided meeting her eyes, forbade it. He was a man locked inside his own history, and she did not have the key. They worked as the sky grew darker. A flash of dry lightning split the horizon, a jagged, silent crack of light, followed by a distant rumble of thunder. As Eli hammered the last shingle into place, the sound of hoofbeats made them both look up. A group of 4 riders was passing on the main road. They were rough men, hands from one of the larger outfits to the south, their faces obscured by the wide brims of their hats. But they weren't just passing. They slowed their horses, turning in their saddles to stare openly at the 2 of them, the cursed rancher and the new schoolteacher, together on a ladder against a stormy sky. It was a long, insolent look, filled with a meaning June couldn't quite decipher, but it made the skin on her arms prickle. Eli's jaw tightened, and he deliberately turned his back on them, coiling his rope. The men shared a low laugh, then spurred their horses, kicking up a cloud of dust as they rode on. As they disappeared, June noticed something. The mud caked on the heels of their boots and speckling their horses' lower legs wasn't the common brown mud of the road or the black muck from the creek. It was a deep, distinctive red, a rusty, brick-colored clay. She had seen that color only once before in the runoff from a small, private quarry a few miles east of town. The quarry. She knew. That belonged to Jasper Stone. Eli climbed down the ladder, his face a granite mask. He gathered his tools, refusing to acknowledge the riders or the tension they had left behind. He was about to leave when June spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Mr. Barrett, that red mud on their boots, where does it come from?" He stopped, his back to her. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. He stood silhouetted against the dark, stormy sky, a man caught between a painful past and a threatening future. "Stone's quarry," he said, his voice flat and empty. Then he walked away, his long strides eating up the ground, leaving June alone with the smell of rain on the dust, the lingering scent of tar, and a collection of dangerous questions that were beginning to connect in her mind. The sky broke without warning. One moment, the sun was a hot weight on the land. The next, the clouds rolled in, thick and gray as wet wool, and the heavens opened. It was not a gentle rain. It was a deluge, a vertical river that hit the baked earth with a sound like a drum roll. The ground, too hard and dry to absorb the sudden onslaught, turned the water away. Rivulets became streams, and streams became torrents, all of it pouring into the lowest point of the landscape, Cottonwood Creek. The dry wash, a place of mud puddles and lizards just that morning, transformed into a churning, muddy beast. Eli was out in the east pasture, trying to drive a handful of new calves to higher ground. When the flash flood hit, the water came as a brown wall, roaring down the creek bed, tearing at the banks and ripping young saplings from their roots. The calves, terrified by the sound and the sudden, rising water, panicked They scattered, their bleating cries thin against the storm's fury. Eli, mounted on Sage, fought to turn them back from the torrent, his face grim, his body slick with rain. June saw it from the schoolhouse door. She saw the rising water and the small, dark shapes of the calves being driven toward the main corral. She pulled a heavy oilskin coat over her dress and ran, her boots sinking in the mud, the cold rain plastering her hair to her face. By the time she reached the corral, Eli was desperately trying to force the last two calves through the wide gate. And then she saw the problem. The gate. The stubborn gate the children had told her about. It was jammed halfway open, its lower edge caught on something in the mud-sodden ground. The rising water, now a powerful current sweeping across the flat, slammed against the partial barrier. Tearing at the hinges, the wood groaned, splintering under the immense pressure. One of the calves, wild-eyed with fear, refused to go through the narrow opening. The other was swept past it, into the main current, and disappeared downstream in a frantic tumble of legs and brown hide. Eli roared in frustration. Throwing his entire weight against the gate, it wouldn't budge. He set his shoulder against the heavy wood and pushed, his boots sliding in the slick mud, his muscles straining to the point of failure. The water was a solid, relentless force, and the gate was beginning to tear loose from its post. In a few more seconds, it would break completely, and the rest of the herd inside the corral would be swept away. June saw his losing battle. She saw the panicked eyes of the cattle inside. She saw the town, a collection of rain-streaked windows, watching from a distance. The thought was a flash, hot and clear in the cold rain. He was alone, fighting a battle in plain sight, and the watchers were just waiting for him to fail, to become another story of the Barrett curse. She plunged into the knee-deep, icy water, her skirt a heavy weight around her legs. She fought her way to his side, the current trying to pull her off her feet. The roar of the water was deafening. "Eli!" she screamed to be heard over the storm. He turned, his face a mask of desperation and surprise at seeing her there. "Get back!" he yelled. "It's going to go." "No!" she shouted back, her voice raw. She looked from his straining body to the town's silent windows and back to his face. All the whispers, all the judgment, all the loneliness she had seen in him coalesced into a single, sharp point of defiance. She put her hands on the gate, feeling the shudder of the tortured wood. She yelled the words, a direct command, a challenge to him and to the storm, and to anyone who might be listening. "Don't be afraid of people watching, I'll hold. You push." The words, a memory of a quieter moment, were reborn as a tool, a strategy. For a heartbeat, Eli stared at her, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat, comprehension dawning in his eyes. It was not about pride. It was about leverage. It was about two people against one impossible task. He gave a sharp nod. He scrambled for a thick fence post that had been knocked loose, jamming one end deep into the mud and wedging the other against the gate. A lever. "Now!" he yelled. June dug her heels into the mud, wrapping her arms around a sturdy crossbeam of the gate, holding it steady against the current, giving his lever a firm point to work against. "Hold." Eli threw his entire body against the post. The lever bit into the gate. Wood screamed against wood. Mud churned. The hinges shrieked. For a terrible, long moment, nothing happened. The water rose, cold and insistent. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the gate broke free from whatever held it. Eli shoved with a final, desperate grunt. The heavy gate swung shut, slamming into the main post with a shuddering boom that they felt through the water. The sudden release of pressure sent them both stumbling. Eli lost his footing, and June, still clinging to the gate, was knocked sideways. They fell together, a tangle of limbs into the churning, muddy water. The cold was a violent shock, stealing the air from her lungs. She went under, and for a disorienting second, there was only brown chaos. Then a strong hand clamped around her arm, hauling her back to the surface. She came up sputtering, gasping for air. Eli was beside her, his face inches from hers, his expression fierce and protective. He held her arm in a grip of iron, keeping her steady against the current. For a moment, they just knelt there in the flood, the rain pouring down on them, the world reduced to the sound of the storm and their own ragged breathing. She was clutching his arm, her fingers digging into the wet fabric of his sleeve, holding on as if he were the only solid thing left on earth. The story reached the Red Dog Saloon before they were even out of the water. A ranch hand, taking shelter under the mercantile's awning, had seen the whole thing, or his version of it. "Saw him fall," he announced, shaking the water from his hat. "The teacher and Barrett. She was holding on to him something fierce in the middle of the creek." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "And I heard her yelling at him just before, something about holding and pushing." A lewd chuckle went around the room. Silas, the card player, slapped his knee. "Well, I'll be—" The quiet ones took a flash flood for the schoolmarm to get bold. The saloon erupted in laughter, the raw, ugly sound of men turning a moment of desperate survival into a sordid joke. The story was set. June Mallory's practical command was twisted into a scandalous proposition, another piece of evidence that getting close to Eli Barrett led to ruin in this case, the ruin of a good woman's reputation. Eli's ranch house was small, but it was warm and dry. A fire roared in the cast-iron stove, hissing as drips of water fell from their soaked clothing, which they'd hung on chairs pulled close to the heat. They were wrapped in thick wool blankets, sitting on opposite sides of a small wooden table, mugs of steaming black coffee cupped in their hands. The silence in the small room was a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. It was a dense, heavy silence, filled with the scent of wet wool, brewing coffee, and the clean smell of the pine smoke. Eli stared into his mug, his face flushed a dark red that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. He had heard the talk when he'd gone to the mercantile for coffee, a quick trip while June was changing in his spare room. He'd felt the smirks, heard the half-whispers. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, the words stiff and formal. "About what they're saying in town. They twisted your words." June looked at him over the rim of her own mug. She wasn't embarrassed. Her expression was calm, a little weary, but steady. A small smile touched her lips. "Mr. Barrett, I meant exactly what I said. The gate was stuck. It needed to be held, and it needed to be pushed. I would have said the same thing to the blacksmith." She took a sip of coffee. "What a small group of bored men choose to imagine is their business, not mine." Her directness seemed to take the air out of his anger and shame. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a delicate Easterner in need of defending, but a woman as steadfast as an old oak. The tension in his shoulders eased. He shook his head, a gesture of disbelief. "You're not like anyone else here." The quiet settled in again, but it was different this time. Easier. The shared danger, the warmth of the fire. Her simple refusal to be shamed, it had changed the space between them. Eli traced a pattern on the table with his finger, his gaze distant. "The gate," he started, his voice barely a murmur. "Owen, he always said I built it too heavy, said it took a mule to move it." He stopped, the name hanging in the air like a ghost. He had not spoken his brother's name to another soul in 3 years. June didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't offer a single word of sympathy. She simply sat with him in the silence, her presence a quiet invitation for him to continue if he chose. She reached for the coffee pot on the stove and refilled his mug, a simple, grounding gesture. He took a breath, the sound rough in his throat. He was the one who was good with the calves. He could gentle them just by talking. That one that got swept away, Owen would have saved it. It was half a sentence, an unfinished thought, a confession of guilt that had been locked away for years. He said nothing more, lapsing back into a deep, brooding silence. But a crack had appeared in the wall. A sliver of his pain had escaped into the warm air of the kitchen. June let the silence be. She knew it was a sacred space. He had offered her a piece of his story, a shard of his loss, and she accepted it by not demanding more. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the rain lessen and the fire crackle. The shared warmth and the quiet confession had created a fragile truce, a small island of peace in the middle of their respective storms. Then, a new sound cut through the night, the distinct, rhythmic squeak of a saddle, followed by the soft thud of a horse's hooves stopping on the muddy ground just outside the front gate. There was no call, no announcement, just silence. Eli's head snapped up, his body instantly alert. Every trace of vulnerability was gone, replaced by a hard, wary tension. He rose slowly, moving to the window and peering through a crack in the curtains. June's heart began to beat a little faster. The storm outside was over, but she had the sudden, chilling feeling that a different kind of storm was just beginning. Someone was out there in the dark, watching the house where the lonely rancher and the schoolteacher sat together by the fire. The watcher from the night before was gone by dawn. All that remained were the deep prints of a single horse's hooves in the mud outside the gate, a silent testament to a long, patient vigil. As Eli prepared for the day's work, a new, unspoken understanding existed between him and June, the fragile confession of the night before, combined with the shared threat of the silent observer, had forged a tentative alliance. They were no longer just a lonely rancher and the town schoolteacher. They were two people in a shared circle of light, with the darkness pressing in. While Eli checked on the shaken herd, June walked to the gate, her gaze fixed on the disturbed earth. She knelt, her fingers hovering over one of the hoof prints. There, embedded in the churned-up mud of the ranch, was a small, foreign clod of earth that had likely fallen from the watcher's boot or the horse's leg. It had dried in the morning sun. It was a deep, rusty red. She picked it up. It was hard and gritty. She brought it to the palm of her hand and crushed it with her thumb. It broke apart into a fine, abrasive powder, staining her skin with its unmistakable color, the color of the mud on the rider's boots, the color of the earth from Jasper Stone's quarry. She found Eli by the corral, splicing a rope. He worked with his usual quiet intensity, his hands moving with practiced skill. She stood before him and opened her palm, revealing the red dust that coated her skin. "The man who was watching us last night," she said, her voice low and steady. "He works for Stone." Eli stopped his work. He looked at the red dust on her hand, and his face hardened into a familiar, closed-off mask. He wiped his own hands on his trousers, a gesture of finality, as if brushing away her conclusion. "It proves nothing," he said, turning back to his rope. "Lots of men ride by this way. They don't all leave behind mud from a private quarry miles in the other direction," she countered. She would not be dismissed. The riders who passed yesterday, the man last night, the tar on the schoolhouse wall, your gate that keeps getting stuck. Don't you see? These aren't just accidents. They're messages. They're part of a plan. Eli pulled the rope taut with a sharp, angry jerk. "And what plan is that to haunt me with whispers and sticky gates? Stone doesn't need tricks. He has the law. He has my father's signature on a piece of paper. He just has to wait." "He isn't waiting," June insisted, her voice rising with urgency. "He's pushing. He's trying to make the curse look real. A broken gate, a spooked herd, maybe a fire that looks like an accident. Anything to make you fail, to make you seem incompetent and unlucky, so that when the bank takes your land, everyone will just nod and say it was the Barrett sentence running its course." Eli finally threw the rope down. He turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a frustration that was years in the making. "So we know. What then? Do you want me to ride into town and accuse the most powerful man in the county of splashing tar on your wall? He'll laugh me out of his office. Touching Jasper Stone is a fool's game. It's asking for trouble you can't handle." His voice was rough with the bitter taste of experience. He knew how this world worked. The big fish ate the little ones, and he was a very little fish. June took a step closer. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. Her green eyes were as fierce as his. "We've already been touched," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense pitch that cut through his anger. "He touched us first. The moment his men started meddling with your gate, the moment someone threw that tar on a building full of children. The trouble was already here. We can either stand still and let him run us over, Or we can find out exactly what he's doing, and why." Her words hung in the air between them, sharp and undeniable. She was right. The fight had already come to them. Eli looked at her, at the defiant set of her jaw and the unwavering resolve in her eyes. She was not afraid. Or if she was not letting fear make her decisions. For 3 years, he had done nothing but endure, reacting to the disasters that befell him. She was asking him to act, to push back against the shadows instead of just living in them. It was a terrifying, exhilarating thought. The memory of her voice in the storm, clear and commanding, returned to him. "I'll hold. You push." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The quarry," he said. "If they're doing something, they'll do it at night." That night, they rode out, not on the main road, but through the winding, moon-dappled canyons that Eli knew like the back of his own hand. They left the horses tethered in a grove of cottonwoods and made the final approach on foot, moving like ghosts through the scrub and rock. The quarry was a great, dark wound in the earth, a pit of red clay that glowed faintly under the sliver of a moon. On the far side, a single wooden shed stood next to a stack of shipping crates, a pair of torches on either side of its door casting long, flickering shadows. They found a position on a rocky ledge overlooking the work area, hidden in the deep darkness. The air was cool and smelled of pine and dust. Below, several men were working, their movements illuminated by the unsteady torchlight. They weren't quarrying stone. They were loading heavy wooden barrels onto a wagon. The sound of their work was a collection of dull thuds and the metallic scrape of shovels. Eli and June watched in silence, their senses sharp. A name, barked in a low command, drifted up to them. Caleb. It was one of the men June had seen riding past the schoolhouse. As he turned to lift a barrel, the torchlight caught his face. He was young, barely a man, his expression sullen. Then the smell reached them. It was faint at first, carried on a gust of wind, but it was unmistakable. The sharp, acrid, chemical stench of creosote, the same smell that had clung to the wall of her school. "The barrels," June whispered, her voice tight. "It's the same tar." They watched as the men finished loading one wagon and started on another. It was clear this was a clandestine operation. The movements were hurried, the voices low. These were not the actions of men engaged in legitimate business. As one of the workers, a burly man with a thick beard, leaned against the shed to wipe his brow, something small and metallic fell from his vest, landing silently in the red dust near the doorway. He didn't notice. He took a swig from a canteen and went back to work. They waited for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the wagons were loaded. The men doused the torches, plunging the quarry into near total darkness, and led the wagons away, their wheels creaking softly into the night. Eli and June remained still, listening until the last sound had faded. Silence returned, broken only by the chirping of crickets. "Now," Eli murmured. They scrambled down the rocky incline, their movements swift and silent. They were taking a huge risk, but they had to know more. They reached the shed, their boots making no sound in the soft dust. The air was thick with the lingering smell of tar. Eli stood guard, his hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip, while June went directly to the spot where the object had fallen. She knelt, her fingers sifting through the dust. They closed around a small, cool piece of metal. She stood and held it up to the faint moonlight. It was a brass button, heavy and ornate, and engraved on its surface, small but clear, was a logo, a stylized, intertwined with AB. Stone Bank. "Eli," she breathed, holding it out to him. He took it, his thumb rubbing across the familiar design. It was the button from a bank clerk's uniform, or perhaps a decorative one from a waistcoat Jasper Stone might provide to his personal agents. It was the thread, the undeniable thread that connected the men, the tar, and the bank. They moved quickly now. They found the barrels of tar, just as they'd suspected. But there was something else. Tucked behind the crates was a small, locked strongbox. It was too heavy to move. Their time was running out. They needed to get the evidence they had and disappear. June carefully wrapped the brass button in her handkerchief and tucked it into her pocket. Eli found a burlap sack and, using a shovel left behind by the workers, scooped up a large sample of the distinctive red clay, along with a few loose rocks from the quarry floor, proof of where they had been. It was the nervous stomp of their own horse that gave them away. A faint whinny carried on the night air from the grove where they'd left them. From the darkness at the quarry's entrance, a voice shouted, "Who's there?" Instantly, the shadows detached themselves. 2 men, left behind as guards, had been hidden in the rocks. A metallic click echoed across the pit, the unmistakable sound of a rifle hammer being cocked. Eli reacted without thinking. His arm shot out, grabbing June's waist and pulling her down with him behind a large pile of iron ore slag. The world exploded in a flash of orange and a deafening boom. A bullet ricocheted off the rock just above their heads, sending a shower of stone chips raining down on them. The shot echoed through the canyon, a violent rip in the night's fabric. Eli pushed the burlap sack into June's hands. "Go," he ordered, his voice a low growl. Through the rocks back to the horses he drew his Colt, the worn metal cool and familiar in his hand. Another shot rang out, closer this time. He peered around the edge of their cover. He could see the muzzle flashes, but not the men themselves. They were pinned down. He knew he couldn't fight his way out, not with June there. He needed a diversion. He took a steadying breath, the acrid smell of gunpowder stinging his nostrils. He raised his pistol, aimed not at the flashes, but high, towards the rock face above the shooters. He fired once. The roar of his Colt was different in the enclosed space, deeper and more powerful. The bullet struck the cliff wall, whining off into the darkness. The men below, not knowing who was shooting or from where, fell silent for a crucial second. "Go now," Eli hissed. He gave June a hard shove towards a narrow, dark crevice in the canyon wall. She scrambled into the darkness, clutching the sack of evidence. Eli fired one more shot into the night, then followed her, plunging into the tight, rocky passage. Their hearts hammered against their ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. Behind them, they could hear the men shouting, their voices confused but angry. They were a pack of hounds that had lost the scent, but only for a moment. Eli and June ran, stumbling over loose rocks, their breath coming in ragged, burning gasps, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them as they fled through the dark heart of the stony land. The moon was a smear of blood hanging low in the sky, staining the clouds and the pale, dusty ground with a sinister, crimson light. The world was stripped of its color, rendered in shades of black and rust. Beneath it, 3 horses galloped, their hooves a frantic, syncopated drumbeat against the hard-packed earth. 3 riders, hunched low in their saddles, dark shapes of pursuit, and ahead of them, 2 more, riding as one, pushing their mounts to the brink of exhaustion. Eli rode with a grim, focused desperation, his body a tense line from his heels to his hat. June sat behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, the burlap sack of evidence clutched in one hand. Her face was pressed against his back. Her world narrowed to the thunder of the horse's heart, the burning in her own lungs, and the feel of Eli's muscles coiling and uncoiling beneath her hands. The night air tore at them, cold and sharp, filled with the taste of their own fear. A gunshot cracked, louder than the hoofbeats, and a bullet whined past Eli's ear. A deadly insect in the dark. Ahead, a black slash cut through the landscape the canyon carved by Cottonwood Creek, and spanning it was their only hope, Cotton Bridge. It was less a bridge and more a prayer made of old timber and rope, a swaying, narrow path built for foot traffic, not for horses at a full gallop. As they drew closer, they could hear it groaning in the wind, a low, mournful sound like a dying animal. "Hold on," Eli's voice was a raw bark, nearly lost in the wind. He didn't slow. He spurred Sage forward, and the mare, trusting him completely, launched herself onto the bridge. The wooden planks bowed and shrieked under their combined weight. The entire structure swayed violently from side to side. Below them, The darkness of the canyon was absolute, a hungry void that promised a final, silent fall. Their pursuers were right behind them. Another shot rang out, and this time it found its mark. A bullet tore through a plank just ahead of Sage's hooves, sending a shower of splinters into the air like a swarm of angry bees. The horse shied, her hooves skittering dangerously close to the edge. Eli fought her back to the center, his voice a low, steady murmur that was for the horse alone. They were halfway across. The main support ropes, thick as a man's arm, stretched ahead of them into the gloom. June's mind worked with the sharp, cold clarity that comes with terror. They would never outrun them. They had to stop them here. Her eyes darted around, searching for a weapon, a tool, anything. Her gaze fell on the lantern hanging from Eli's saddle horn, its candle guttering wildly inside the glass. An idea, desperate and dangerous, flashed in her mind. The rope she screamed into his ear, her voice thin against the gale. "We have to cut the ropes," even as she spoke. She was acting. She fumbled with the sack of evidence, pushing it inside her coat. She grabbed the hammer they had used to fix the schoolhouse roof, which Eli had tucked into his saddle ties. Then she reached for the lantern. With a cry of effort, she swung it hard against one of the thick secondary ropes that ran alongside the bridge path. The glass shattered. The candle was extinguished, but a splash of burning oil arced through the air, and a small, hungry flame licked at the dry, weathered hemp. The fire caught, a tiny orange flower blossoming in the darkness, and began to chew its way up the rope, fed by the wind. Eli understood instantly. He drew his knife, the one she had returned to him, its worn wooden handle a familiar shape in his hand. He leaned precariously out of the saddle, the horse still moving forward, and slashed at the main support rope on their side of the bridge. The blade bit deep into the taut fibers. He sawed at it with frantic energy, the rope groaning as its strands parted one by one. Behind them, their pursuers had reached the bridge. One of them, the burly, bearded man from the quarry, spurred his horse forward, intent on crossing before the structure failed. With a final, explosive crack, the rope Eli was cutting gave way. The tension on the bridge shifted catastrophically. The entire structure dropped on one side, planks ripping free, timber screaming in protest. Half the bridge tore away and plunged into the abyss, a waterfall of splintered wood and severed rope. Their own horse, Sage, scrambled for purchase on the remaining, tilting section of the bridge, finding solid ground on the far side of the canyon just as the path behind them ceased to exist. But they were not alone. With a desperate shout, the bearded man had thrown himself from his horse at the last possible second, launching his body across the newly formed chasm. He landed hard on the edge of the remaining bridge, his fingers scrabbling for a hold. He was a man possessed, his face a mask of fury in the flickering light of the burning rope. He lunged for Eli, tackling him from the saddle. The two men crashed onto the narrow, unstable planks. Eli's revolver was knocked from his hand, skittering over the edge and into the darkness. They were a tangle of limbs, trading desperate, clumsy blows. The man was heavier and stronger, his weight pinning Eli down. His hand closed around Eli's throat, squeezing, his face contorted with rage. Stone pays well for silence. He snarled, his breath hot and foul. June, thrown clear from the horse, had landed hard on her wrist. A sharp, sickening pain shot up her arm, but she ignored it. She saw the struggle, saw Eli's face turning dark, his hands clawing at the man's thick arms. She still had the hammer. She scrambled forward, her injured wrist protesting with a wave of nausea, and swung the heavy tool with her good hand. She didn't aim for his head. She aimed for his hand, the one holding the pistol he had just drawn. The heavy iron head of the hammer connected with his wrist with a dull, wet crunch. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. His fingers spasmed open, and the pistol fell, bouncing once before disappearing into the canyon. The blow, however, shifted their weight. Eli's heel slipped in the mud and dust, his boot sliding off the edge of the broken bridge. For a terrifying second, he was dangling over the abyss, his only purchase the grip he had on his attacker's coat. And in that second, the world fell away. The roaring in his ears was no longer the wind, but the sound of shifting rock. The darkness below was not just a canyon, but a grave. The memory of Owen, swallowed by the earth, rose up and consumed him. The sight of his brother's disappearing form, the feeling of utter, paralyzing helplessness, it crashed over him like a physical wave. His muscles went slack, his grip faltered. The strength, the will to fight, drained out of him, pulled into the same void that had taken his brother. He was letting go. Eli June's voice cut through the fog of his memory. Sharp and clear. He was falling, but he turned his head, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. She was on her knees, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terror that was not for herself, but for him. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice fierce, an anchor in the swirling chaos of his past. "Owen is gone. You are here. Stay here. With me." Her words were a lifeline. Stay here. Not in the past, not in the guilt, but here, now, on this broken bridge. He looked into her eyes and saw not pity, but a desperate, powerful belief. He saw himself reflected there, not as a cursed man, but as the man she was refusing to let go. Something broke inside him, not his grip, but the hold the past had on him. A surge of adrenaline, of pure, savage will to live, flooded his body. With a roar that was torn from the deepest part of his soul, he heaved himself up. He used the man's own weight as leverage, twisting his body and driving his elbow into his attacker's throat. The man choked, his grip loosening. Eli scrambled back onto the solid planks, pulling the man with him, and in one fluid motion, drove his fist into the man's jaw. The man's head snapped back, and he collapsed, unconscious, onto the bridge. Silence. The only sounds were their own ragged gasps for breath, the whisper of the wind, and the crackle of the last embers of the burning rope. The other pursuers were gone, having retreated from the impassable chasm. Eli knelt on the bridge, his body trembling with reaction, his knuckles bloody. He looked at his hands, then at June. She was cradling her right wrist, her face tight with pain. The burlap sack lay nearby, soaked from a puddle on the bridge but miraculously intact. He crawled to her side. "Your wrist," he said, his voice hoarse. "I think it's sprained," she said through gritted teeth. Without a word, he pulled the dusty neckerchief from around his throat. His hands, which had been instruments of brutal violence only moments before, were now impossibly gentle as he carefully wrapped her wrist, his calloused fingers working with a practiced, tender efficiency to create a makeshift splint. They were alive, battered, exhausted, but alive. He helped her to her feet, and they staggered off the broken bridge onto the solid ground of the far bank, leaving the unconscious man where he lay, and then they saw it. On the rise ahead, scattered in the darkness, were small, moving lights, dozens of them. They looked like a constellation of fallen stars, a swarm of fireflies bobbing in the night. As they drew closer, they could make out the shapes of those who held them. Small shapes. It was the children, her students, Samuel and Sarah and the others, their small, worried faces illuminated by the lanterns they carried. They had waited for her, and when she did not return from her walk to Lone Spur, they had grown afraid. They had gathered their courage and their lights, and had come searching for their Miss June. The sight broke something in June. The terror and the pain and the exhaustion of the night crested and fell away, replaced by a wave of overwhelming emotion. These small lights, this small, brave army, had come for her. The blood moon had finally retreated, sinking behind a bank of clouds. The world returned to its normal, softer shades of gray and black. The pursuit was a distant memory. The only sounds were the soft murmur of the children's voices and the tired sighs of the horse. Eli and June stood together in the circle of lantern light, their shoulders almost touching. The cool night air swirled around them, and their breaths, warm and visible, mingled in the space between them. They had crossed the bridge. They had survived. And, for the first time, in the quiet, shared warmth of their breathing. Neither of them felt entirely alone. The church in Dust Creek served a dual purpose. Its pews witnessed to both Sunday sermons and weekday justice. On this Tuesday morning, the air was thick not with the scent of old hymns and beeswax, but with a palpable, anxious tension. The space felt less like a house of God and more like a courtroom, with Judge Hale, who was also Reverend Hale, sitting not at the pulpit but behind a sturdy oak table at the front, his face a study in solemn neutrality. He was a man accustomed to weighing the sins of the soul and the crimes of the flesh. And today, the two seemed inextricably linked. Eli and June stood before him. Between them and the judge, on a smaller table, lay the sum of their perilous night, a burlap sack, still damp, containing a sample of rich, red clay, and next to it, resting on June's clean handkerchief, the small, damning piece of evidence, a single brass button, its engraved SB logo catching the morning light that streamed through the tall, arched windows. The pews were not empty. A dozen or so townspeople sat scattered throughout the benches, drawn by the promise of a confrontation that had been simmering for years. Hattie from the saloon was there, her usual smirk replaced by an expression of keen interest. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Big Sam, filled an entire end of a row by himself, his massive arms crossed over his chest. They trespassed on my property. A smooth, controlled voice cut through the silence. Jasper Stone stood in the aisle, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his thin smile firmly in place. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. They were seen fleeing my quarry. These wild accusations are nothing more than the desperate fantasies of a man who is about to lose his land, aided by a woman of questionable judgment. We have evidence, June stated, her voice clear and unwavering. Her injured wrist was neatly bandaged, and she held herself with a defiant poise. This button was dropped by one of your men. The mud in this sack is from your quarry. We believe they have been systematically sabotaging Mr. Barrett's ranch to ensure he defaults on his loan. Stone gave a soft, dismissive laugh. A button and some dirt. This is your grand proof, Judge. I have something far more concrete. He stepped forward and laid his papers on the judge's table with a triumphant finality. I have a legally binding contract, a promissory note, signed by Eli Barrett's father and co-signed by Mr. Barrett himself. The terms are explicit. The final payment is due in 3 days. If it is not paid, the deed for the Lone Spur Ranch transfers to the bank. Debt is debt. The law is the law. Everything else is just noise. He tapped a manicured finger on the signature line. The document, with its crisp print and official seals, seemed to possess a far greater weight than a lost button and a bag of dirt. Judge Hale looked from the contract to the evidence, then to Eli's stony face and June's determined one. He was a cautious man, a man who understood the intricate web of power in Dust Creek. He could not ignore the evidence, but he could not defy the clear letter of the law, especially when it was wielded by the man who held the note on half the town, including the church itself. He cleared his throat. These are serious allegations. But Mr. Stone is correct. A loan is a legal obligation. He picked up a pinch of the red clay, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. However, this evidence cannot be dismissed out of hand. He looked at Eli. I will send the sheriff out to Lone Spur and to the quarry to take official soil samples for comparison. In the meantime, I'm granting a 3-day grace period for this investigation. 3 days. He looked pointedly at Stone, then back at Eli. After which, Mr. Barrett, the terms of your contract will be enforced. It was a small victory, but it felt like a defeat. 3 days. The deadline had not moved. All the judge had given them was time to prove they were right, but no time to actually fix the underlying problem. They left the church and stepped out into the gray, overcast day, the weight of the ticking clock settling upon them. I'll sell the yearlings, Eli said, his voice flat as they walked back towards the ranch. The hope that had flickered within him was gone, replaced by a grim resignation. All of them. If I sell them now, even at a loss, it might be enough to clear the debt. June stopped, turning to face him. Sell them now, at the end of the season. With winter coming, you'll get a quarter of what they're worth. It would be a slaughter. It's better than losing the land, he shot back, his frustration boiling over. It's the only way. No, it isn't, she insisted, her voice soft but firm. Selling your young stock to pay a bad debt is like cutting off your arm to cure a splinter. You might survive today, but you'll bleed out tomorrow. You'll have nothing to rebuild with next spring. The ranch will die a slower death. That's what Stone wants. He stared at her, his face a mask of conflict. Everything in his life had taught him to cut his losses, to endure, to accept the inevitable blow. She was asking him to do something different, to have faith, to fight on a different front. They reached the small porch of his ranch house as a fine, misty rain began to fall. It was not a storm, just a gentle, persistent drizzle that blurred the edges of the world and muffled all sound. They stood under the small overhang, the tension of the argument still hanging between them. Eli looked down at her, at the way the damp air curled the loose strands of her hair, at the fierce, unwavering light in her eyes. The turmoil inside him quieted, replaced by a different kind of ache, a feeling of gratitude so immense it had no words. He had been alone for so long, fighting his ghosts and his debts in silence. Now, she stood beside him, her fire warming his cold, solitary world. He didn't plan it. He simply leaned down, his gaze locked on hers. He saw her eyes widen slightly, a flicker of surprise, but she did not pull away. She swayed towards him, her lips parting slightly. The world shrank to the few inches of rain-scented air between them. It was the promise of a different kind of peace, a shelter from the storm that had nothing to do with a roof and everything to do with another person. But just as their lips were about to meet, she gently placed her good hand on his chest, stopping him. Her touch was not a rejection. It was a pause. She looked into his eyes, and her own were filled with a deep, sad wisdom. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Don't make promises while we're still running." He understood. A kiss, a real one, was a promise of a future, a shared destination, and they were not there yet. They were still in the middle of the chase. He straightened up, a sharp pang of disappointment mixed with a profound respect. He gave a slow nod. June's expression shifted, the softness replaced by a sudden, sharp glint of an idea. "He is trying to take your future," she said. "So we will fight him with the one thing he can't control." She looked towards the town, the people. Her plan was simple, audacious, and born of desperation. A town fair, a fundraiser for the school. She marshaled the women of the town with a quiet, infectious energy. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, organized the baking of dozens of corn cakes. Hattie, surprisingly, closed the saloon for the afternoon and brought over 3 enormous jars of her famous peach preserves. Benches were arranged. A ring toss game was built from old horseshoes and wooden stakes, and the dusty clearing in front of the schoolhouse was transformed into a pocket of defiant cheer. On the 3rd day, the day the loan was due, the people of Dust Creek came. At first, they were hesitant, drawn by curiosity but held back by old habits. They stood in small, quiet groups, the whispers about the Barrett curse still a faint, toxic murmur on the air, but the smell of fresh baking, the sight of children laughing as they chased each other, and June's own tireless, welcoming presence began to work a kind of magic. The laughter grew louder, filling the spaces that were once occupied by suspicion. The whispers began to fade. Then, trouble arrived. 2 of Stone's men, the same rough-looking hands from the quarry, rode up to the edge of the fair. They dismounted and started towards the crowd, their expressions sullen and intimidating, their intent clear to disrupt, to remind people whose town this really was. The crowd faltered. Laughter died in throats. But before the men could take more than 2 steps, a large figure moved to block their path. It was Big Sam, the blacksmith. He stood with his arms folded across his massive chest, a silent, immovable wall of muscle and resolve. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His presence was a clear, unambiguous statement. Not here, not today. The two men looked at him, then at the suddenly unified faces of the townspeople behind him, and after a moment of tense silence, they cursed under their breaths, turned, and rode away. A quiet cheer went through the crowd. At that moment, another figure appeared, leading an animal. It was Eli. He walked into the center of the fair, not with his usual downcast gaze, but with his head held high. He was leading a young, healthy calf, its coat sleek and its eyes bright. It was one of the yearlings he had planned to sell, a piece of his own future. He stopped beside June and addressed the crowd, his voice rough but carrying in the sudden hush. "Miss Mallory is trying to build something here," he said. "For the children, for all of us." He patted the calf's flank. "I'm donating this calf. We'll raffle it. All the money goes to the school." A gasp went through the crowd, followed by an eruption of applause. It was a gesture of immense generosity from a man they all knew was on the brink of ruin. It was an act of faith, a public declaration that he was a part of this community, not apart from it. Men who had whispered about his curse now clapped him on the shoulder. Women who had avoided his gaze now smiled at him. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in Dust Creek, the old, tired story of the Barrett curse. A story that had been nourished by fear and isolation began to wither in the bright, warm light of community action. The poison of the rumor was being drawn out, not by a cure, but by a stronger, healthier antidote, a shared hope. Eli looked at June, and in the midst of the cheering crowd, he smiled. A real, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face. They were still running, but for the first time, they were not running alone. The emergency hearing was called as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, sharp shadows across Dust Creek. The church was no longer a space for quiet contemplation. It was packed, every pew filled, with men and women standing along the back walls. The air was electric, thick with the anticipation of a final reckoning. All the small, scattered pieces of the puzzle, a stubborn gate, a splash of tar, a red-soiled boot, a chase in the dark were about to be assembled in the public light. It began not with an accusation, but with a confession. The sheriff brought in Caleb, the young man from the quarry. He was no longer a sullen, menacing figure. He was just a boy, his face pale with fear, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. He stood before Judge Hale and the assembled town, and he spoke, his voice barely a whisper at first, then growing stronger as the truth spilled out of him. "He paid us," Caleb said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Mr. Stone. He paid me and the others, said it was just business, said Barrett's land was collateral on a big loan and we was to protect the bank's investment." A low murmur went through the crowd. "Protected how?" Judge Hale asked, his voice a stern rumble. "He told us to encourage the bad luck," Caleb mumbled. "He gave us a list. Jam the corral gate every now and then, spook the cattle near the canyon, make it look like things were just always going wrong out at Lone Spur. And the schoolhouse." June's voice cut through the room, sharp and clear. "Was that on your list?" Caleb flinched, finally looking up. His eyes were filled with a miserable guilt. "No, ma'am, that was a mistake. We was supposed to splash the tar on the new barn Eli was building, make a stink, make it seem like a bad omen. But it was dark, and we got the wrong building. We never meant to scare no kids. I swear." He looked at Jasper Stone, a flash of defiance in his eyes. He didn't care. When I told him, he just said a scared teacher would probably leave town even faster. The murmur in the church grew louder, angrier. Jasper Stone stood near the front, his face a perfect, unreadable mask of calm. He looked not at Caleb, but at the judge, as if this were all a minor, irritating theatrical. At that moment, the sheriff stepped forward, unrolling a large survey map on the judge's table. "The samples match. Judge," he said, his voice booming in the quiet church. "The red clay from the sack is identical to the clay from the quarry. And the dirt we'd found at the Lone Spur gate, where the kids said they jammed it. It's got traces of the quarry clay mixed in with the local soil. There's no doubt they were there. The physical evidence landed on top of the confession with an audible thud of finality. Judge Hale looked at Stone, his expression hardening. "Mr. Stone, in light of this testimony and this evidence, I am signing a warrant to search the premises of your bank, specifically your private office and storeroom. For the first time," a crack appeared in Stone's composure. A flicker of something cold and sharp, not fear, but fury passed through his eyes. But it was too late. The sheriff and 2 deputies left the church, their purpose clear. The town waited. No one left. They sat in the pews, a silent, collective jury. The last rays of sun slanted through the windows, and someone began lighting the oil lamps that hung from the rafters, pushing back the growing dusk. As the light grew within the church, the long shadows that had filled the room began to shrink, to pull back into the corners, becoming small and insignificant. An hour later, the sheriff returned. He was not alone. He carried a heavy, leather-bound ledger. He placed it on the table before the judge, found it in a locked safe in his back room. The sheriff announced, "It's a paybook, off the official records." He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with Stone's precise, elegant script. It was a meticulous record of a secret war. There were entries for quarry supplies, which included barrels of tar. There were names Caleb's among them with sums of money next to them, the dates corresponding to incidents at the Lone Spur Ranch. And next to one of the largest payments was a small, damning notation for final resolution. The sheriff produced the brass button. He laid it beside an entry in the book. The man they left on the bridge, the one Miss Mallory disabled, was wearing a waistcoat missing a button. This one, it matches the set. The chain of evidence was complete. It was a perfect, unbreakable circle that began and ended with Jasper Stone. Stone finally broke his silence. His voice was not that of a man confessing, but of a man deeply inconvenienced, a man explaining a complex business strategy to simpletons. It was a business decision, he said smoothly, addressing the judge but projecting his voice to the entire room. The Barrett property was a high-risk asset. The family has a history of failure. I hired those men to monitor my collateral, to ensure that Mr. Barrett's predictable incompetence did not devalue the property before the bank could legally take possession of it. I was protecting my investment. A wave of angry muttering swept through the crowd. Protecting it, Big Sam's voice boomed from the back. By trying to ruin him, by scaring our children, that ain't business. That's theft. You call trying to burn a man's barn protecting an asset, another voice shouted. The collective anger of the town, long suppressed by fear and suspicion, finally found its voice. It rose in a single, unified wave against the man who had manipulated them for so long. Stone ignored them, his gaze fixed on Eli. The curse is real, whether you believe in it or not. It is a curse of failure. I was simply managing it. Eli had been silent throughout the proceedings, a still point in the swirling storm. But now he walked forward, stepping into the center of the aisle, into the full light of the lamps. He looked not at the judge, not at the evidence, but directly at Jasper Stone. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 3 years of silent grief and blame. You're right about the curse, Stone, he said, and the entire church fell silent to hear him. But you've had it wrong all this time. He took a step closer to the banker. The Barrett name doesn't carry a curse. Your greed does. The words, simple and direct, struck the heart of the matter with the force of a hammer blow. It was not fate. It was not bad luck. It was malice. It was the deliberate, calculated work of one man's avarice. In that moment of charged silence, June stood up from her seat in the front pew. She walked to where Eli stood in the aisle. She did not speak. She simply reached out and took his hand. She laced her fingers through his in front of the entire town, a simple, profound gesture of allegiance. Then she looked out at the faces watching them, at the wide, curious eyes, and she spoke the words that had become their creed, no longer a private declaration, but a public vow. I don't care who's watching. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the church itself was holding its breath. Then, from the back, a single, sharp sound broke the quiet. The creak of a wooden bench as a man stood up. It was Big Sam. He stood tall, a silent, powerful affirmation. Then another person stood, and another, a farmer and his wife, the baker, a ranch hand, one by one, pew by pew. The people of Dust Creek got to their feet, their faces turned to the front, their posture a silent, unshakable verdict. They were no longer just watchers. They were witnesses, and they were taking a stand. Judge Hale looked out at the sea of standing townspeople, and then at the damning evidence on his table. His duty, which had seemed so complicated, was now perfectly clear. He struck his gavel on the table, the sound echoing the town's unified resolve. "Jasper Stone," he declared, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "This is not a courtroom for business. This is a place of justice. I have reviewed the original loan document. I find a history of exorbitant fees and penalties that you have added, designed to make repayment impossible. Those fees are hereby null and void." A gasp went through the room. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his eyes locked on Stone, "I am restructuring the remainder of the legitimate debt. It will be repaid not on your predatory schedule, but on a seasonal basis, in accordance with the realities of running a ranch in this territory. And finally, for the conspiracy to defraud, for the endangerment of this community, and for the malicious destruction of property, I am levying a fine against you personally, to be paid to Mr. Barrett and to the town, that is equal to the entire value of your so-called investment." It was a total victory, justice clear and complete. Stone stood frozen for a moment, his mask of composure finally shattered, revealing the pale, pinched face of a man who had lost everything. As the crowd began to break, buzzing with the news, a figure approached Eli and June. It was Hattie, the saloon owner, the town's primary purveyor of gossip. She stopped before them, and for the first time, June saw an expression of genuine humility on her face. She placed a hand on her chest. "Mr. Barrett," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. I've said things about your family, about the curse." She swallowed hard. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." Eli looked at her, and the hardness in his face, the defensive shield he had worn for so long, finally dissolved. He gave a simple, forgiving nod. The lamps in the church now burned brightly, throwing a warm, steady glow over everything. The shadows were gone, banished to the furthest, darkest corners. The truth, brought into the open, had proven to be a light strong enough to burn away a lie that had poisoned the town for years. The curse was broken, not because it had ever been real, but because the people of Dust Creek had finally chosen to stand together in the light. The dust of their victory settled slowly, leaving behind a quiet that felt strange and new. In the weeks that followed the hearing, Dust Creek seemed to take its first full, clean breath in years. The oppressive weight of Jasper Stone's influence was gone, and in its place, a fragile but determined optimism began to take root. The air itself felt lighter. One afternoon, the stagecoach brought a letter for June. It was from a town called Silver Mercy, a prosperous mining community 2 days' ride to the north. The envelope was crisp, the handwriting elegant, the wax seal unbroken. Inside was a formal offer for the position of head school teacher. The salary was more than double what she could ever hope to earn in Dust Creek. The offer included lodging a small, clean house with glass windows and a porch, all to herself. It was an offer of security, of respectability, of an easier life. It was everything she had once thought she wanted. She folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, where it felt as heavy and cold as a river stone. That evening, Eli met her as she was leaving the stable school for the day. He didn't say anything at first. He just led her to the small, disused shed at the edge of his property, the first place he had ever offered her shelter. On that first stormy day, it was no longer a dilapidated shack. He had replaced the broken planks, patched the roof properly, and installed a real window with clean panes of glass. A new, sturdy door stood slightly ajar. He stopped before it and held out his hand. Lying in his calloused palm was a simple, newly forged iron key. He looked at her, his gaze direct, his stormy eyes clear and serious. "The stable was never good enough," he said. his voice low and steady. "This is for you, for the school, for the library you talked about." He gently closed her fingers around the key. The metal was cool against her skin. "I want you to stay, June." He took a breath, the words coming with a weight of deep consideration. "Stay as a partner, not as a shadow. A partner." The word echoed in the quiet space between them. It was not the poetic, flowery proposal of a suitor. It was something far more rare and substantial. It was an offer of equality. She looked from the key in her hand to his earnest face, and a wave of feeling so powerful it was akin to fear washed over her. She could feel the solid reality of this place, of this man, beginning to take root in her. Later that night, alone in her small room at the boarding house, she wrestled with that fear. She sat by the window, the letter from Silver Mercy on the table beside the iron key. She looked out at the vast, dark expanse of the plains, a sea of silent, waiting land under a blanket of stars. For her entire life, she had fought against being defined by others, by her family, by a domineering fiancé, by a town's expectations. She had come west to be her own person, beholden to no one. Now, she feared being swallowed by the sheer scale of the land, by the endless cycle of seasons and work that governed life on a ranch. She feared being absorbed into the quiet, powerful gravity of a man who spoke so little but felt so deeply. To stay would be to tie her fate to his, to the fate of the Lone Spur Ranch. Would her own identity, the one she had fought so hard to claim, simply dissolve into the dust of this place, becoming just a small part of Eli Barrett's world? The clean little house in Silver Mercy, the respectable salary they represented a life that was hers alone. It was the safer choice. The next morning, she found Eli in his small office, the ranch's ledger open before him. This book, which had once been a chronicle of his debt and despair, now lay open to a fresh, clean page. He looked up as she entered and gestured to the chair beside him. He had been waiting for her. He didn't speak of love or feelings. He spoke of the future, in the only language he knew for certain, the language of work and numbers. He took a pencil and drew a clean, straight line down the center of the page. At the top of the left column, he wrote Lone Spur Ranch. At the top of the right, he wrote Dust Creek Library School. "A partnership," he said, tapping the page. "This is how it works." He began to write, his blocky script filling the page. He outlined a plan to divide the ranch's modest but now stable profits. A portion for savings, a portion for supplies, and the rest to be split evenly. He explained his plans for the new herd, how the calf he had raffled had created so much goodwill that 2 other ranchers had offered him favorable terms on breeding stock. Then he pushed the ledger towards her. "Your half is the library," he said. "Any money from the town, any funds you raise, that's yours to control. But the ranch supports the school, and the school supports the town, which supports the ranch. It's all one thing. We run it together. Your name goes in the book right next to mine." June stared at the ledger. It was the most romantic thing she had ever seen. It was not a poem. It was a contract. It was not a declaration of ownership, but a blueprint for a shared life, built on a foundation of mutual respect. He wasn't asking her to be a rancher's wife who helped with the books. He was asking her to be a co-founder of their shared enterprise. He was not trying to absorb her world into his. He was offering to merge them, to create something new and stronger than either could be alone. Her fear of being a shadow vanished, replaced by the clear, bright vision of what it meant to be a partner. In the days that followed, they worked together, transforming the old shed. They built shelves from fresh pine, and the scent of sawdust mingled with the old, sweet smell of dried hay. June unpacked the crates of books she had brought with her, her small personal collection that she had guarded on her long journey west. Eli handled the heavy lifting, his quiet presence a steadying force, while she organized the volumes, her hands moving with a joyful purpose. The afternoon sun streamed through the new window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into flecks of gold. It was a space filled with the smell of old paper and new beginnings. The land itself seemed to exhale in relief. The autumn rains were gentle, the grass in the pastures grew thick, and the new calves, born to a healthy herd, were strong and energetic. The sky at sunset was no longer a harsh, unforgiving canvas, but a soft wash of deep, burnished copper, promising a peaceful night and a clear day to follow. News came from town that Jasper Stone, facing disgrace and a mountain of fines, had sold the bank to a consortium from a larger city and had left Dust Creek on the morning stage. He was gone. His name, once a source of fear and power, became just another story told in the past tense. A quiet, collective sigh of relief passed through the entire community. That evening, June sat alone in the newly finished library, the letter from Silver Mercy in her hands. She read it one last time. A clean house, a good salary, an easy life. It was a picture of a perfectly fine future, but it was a future in black and white. Here, in this dusty, book-scented room, with the sound of a healthy herd settling for the night just outside the door, she had discovered a life of vibrant, unexpected color. Slowly, deliberately, she folded the letter, slipped it back into its crisp envelope, and placed it in the bottom of an empty drawer. She would not be sending a reply. She walked back to the main house. Eli was on the porch, sitting on the top step, silhouetted against the deepening twilight. The wind, now a gentle breeze, stirred the small, hand-painted sign that hung over the library door. She could just make out the word she had taught her students, the word he had overheard in the dark: hope. He wasn't looking at her, but he knew she was there. He shifted slightly on the step, leaving a space beside him. An invitation. June went and sat down. The worn wood of the porch cooled beneath her. She was close enough that her shoulder brushed against his. They didn't speak. There was no need for words. They simply sat together, watching the first stars appear in the vast, velvet sky. The silence was comfortable, complete. It was a silence big enough to hold everything they had been through, and everything that was to come. It was a silence quiet enough to finally hear your own heart settle into the peaceful, steady rhythm of home. The sound that marked the end of the day was the ringing of a small brass bell. Its clear, cheerful tone cut through the afternoon quiet, a new and hopeful sound in the Dust Creek air. A moment later, the door to the library burst open and the children spilled out into the sunshine. They were a small, boisterous tribe, their hands and faces smudged with chalk dust, their bare feet kicking up clouds of dirt as they ran. They were laughing, a dry, raspy sound from throats full of dust and joy, their voices chasing each other into the wide-open spaces. June stood in the doorway, watching them go, a soft smile on her face. Behind her, Eli was on a small ladder, hammer in hand. He was carefully hanging a new sign above the door, a long, handsomely carved piece of pine. He had spent weeks on it, working in the evenings by lantern light, carving each letter with a slow, patient hand. When he was finished, he climbed down, and they stood side by side, looking up at their work, in deep, clear letters. The sign read, Lone Spur Library School. It was a declaration, a binding of two names and two futures into a single, solid thing. June turned to him, her expression soft. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a neatly folded square of cloth. It was the neckerchief he had torn to bandage her wrist on the night of the chase. She had washed it and carefully mended the tear with stitches so fine they were almost invisible. And in one corner, in a simple, steady line of dark blue thread, she had embroidered a single word. She held it out to him. "I believe this is yours," she said, her voice quiet, echoing the words she had spoken when she returned his knife. He took it from her, his calloused fingers gentle on the soft fabric. He unfolded it and saw the word, "Stay." He read it, and then he looked at her, and his stormy eyes held a depth of feeling that no words could ever have expressed. He folded the cloth carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, placing it over his heart. Later, as the sun dipped towards the horizon and the day's heat began to fade, they sat at the kitchen table in his small ranch house. The ledger was open between them. The pages, which had once been filled with the terrifying arithmetic of debt, were now a map of their future. The columns of numbers no longer represented a threat, but a plan. So much hay for the winter, a payment for new breeding stock, an order for new primers and slates from a supplier in the east. The numbers were no longer a sentence of doom. They were a list of things to be done, a litany of shared work and shared purpose. The room was filled with a quiet harmony of smells. The rich, dark aroma of brewing coffee mingled with the honest scent of warm saddle leather from the gear hanging by the door. And underneath it all, the faint, sweet, dusty perfume of old books and paper seemed to cling to their clothes and hair, a constant reminder of the new heart of their shared enterprise. It was the smell of their life. June looked across the table at Eli, at his strong, quiet hands resting on the open ledger. She thought of the letter from Silver Mercy, folded away in a drawer, a pale and lifeless ghost of a different future. That life would have been safe, predictable. It would have been easy, but it would not have been this. It would not have had this depth, this texture, this feeling of having been forged in fire and fear, and finally, in faith. She had come west seeking independence, and had found something far more valuable, a partnership. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the open page. "Let's go deeper," she said softly, the words a quiet revelation even to herself. Into this ordinary, difficult, beautiful life. Eli turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. His grip was warm and solid. He looked at her, his gaze steady, holding her completely. "No hurry," he said, his voice a low, sure rumble, "but I'm not letting go." He stood, gently pulling her to her feet. He led her out onto the porch, into the soft, golden light of the encroaching dusk. They stopped directly beneath the new wooden sign. He placed his hands on her shoulders. And this time, when he leaned down, she did not stop him. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or desperate relief. It was a kiss that was as calm and steady and sure as the man himself. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and dust and sunlight. It was a promise, not of a fairy tale, but of shared sunrises and common labor. It was a quiet, deliberate sealing of the contract they had written in the ledger and built with their own hands. They stood there, under the new sign, in the open air, with no thought for who might be watching. In the distance, the lights of Dust Creek began to appear, one by one. Small, steady pinpricks of warmth in the vast twilight. The long, bloody shadow of the past had finally receded. The dust that settled on the road in the evening air seemed less red now, more the color of honest, fertile earth. Tomorrow, they would wake up early, before the sun. He would feed the calves. She would open the books. And then they would walk out together and face the day, their hands linked, ready for the simple, profound work of building a life in the heart of the Wild West. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Please leave a comment below and let us know your city or country, and share your thoughts on Eli and June's journey. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, for more stories from the frontier. Don't forget to like this video and hit the hype button to help us share this story with more listeners like you.